Hey there, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Blessed Are the Binary Breakers. You might have noticed that I'm posting this episode on a Tuesday instead of a Sunday. That's because I've decided to change the publishing schedule from every other Sunday to every other Tuesday. Based on the past month or so, I think that schedule will work better for me. Friends, the person we are about to hear from is really, really cool. I was so excited to get to speak with Reverend Josephine Inkpin, who is a priest in the Anglican Church of Australia, and who just has some beautiful things to say about being transgender and what it means to be a whole faith community that is called to transition, to transform, and to have a God who is also transformative. I just want to give y'all a heads up that I don't know if it's because we were recording from opposite halves of the world or just because the Wi-Fi in my house is really bad, but throughout the episode, you'll occasionally hear some less than wonderful audio quality. I was really worried about having bad quality on her end, but it turns out once I listened back to the episode that a lot of the things that I say have the choppier quality. So I'm so sorry that the audio isn't as good as I would like it to be, but I promise you it is still so worth it to listen to Joe speak. So I will make sure to get the transcript for this episode up tomorrow, probably sometime tomorrow evening. At the latest, Thursday morning is when I'll be posting a transcript online. I don't know if y'all have noticed, but I have started, with each episode, I finished the transcript at the same, and published that at the same time that I published the audio episode. This one's transcript is coming out a little later just because my family kept distracting me as I was trying to get that typed out. So that's why it's not coming out at the same exact time, but it will be out at the latest in a couple days. I've been posting those at transchristianity.com/podcast. My podcast description includes that link. So sorry about the occasional spotty quality. Most of it's still quite good and easy to hear. It's just every now and then words sort of cut out and pop back in. But get ready because this is a really powerful episode.
It's so wonderful to see you. I love your podcast. Yeah. I think you do such fabulous work. I was thinking this morning, it'd be lovely to get that if we were all together in one room having a party or something. And you could go around with the video camera as well. But it's such a variety. I'm really impressed, in terms of breaking all sorts of binaries and boundaries. It's, the different strands, often you find it'll be from one particular thing, but, your brain. But the other thing I find is quite striking is, listening to a number of different people, is the resonances. It's, different parts of people's stories, which you think, oh, yes, that's it. You've got it. That's what I wanted.
It is very cool. And I'm so excited to be talking to you. You're welcome to share as much about your personal life as you want. I do also think it's cool that you're sort of already, to an extent, in some public spotlight, which means people can go to other sources to find a lot of the details about your story, which means that if you want to share more about your thoughts on theology, we can spend a lot of time on that instead. So it's all up to you, but
yeah, I mean, you listen beautifully, I have to say. That's one of the things, because you give people space to speak. But I mean, your questions are great, of keeping people on track. So, I mean, I'm interested, in conversation as well. So if you've got things, you just sort of go, oh, wow, what does that mean? I'm not really into too much of a monologue, but I do speak a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's your job to speak the most today. So speak as much as you want to. Yeah. So, I mean, you've listened to some of the episodes, so you know that I usually just kind of start with the question of what's the first thing right off the bat that you want listeners to know about you?
Okay. Well, my name's Joe, or short for Josephine. There's a story in that as well. And you probably tell from my accent that I'm English. That was where I was born, brought up. And I've been in Australia for nearly 20 years. And there's a bit of a story in that as well. And I'm, amongst other things, I'm a priest and I'm married. And apparently I'm the only, or the first rather, openly transgender priest in Australia, although there's some other folk around and some on the way. So that's been an interesting journey for me as well. There's lots of other things I could say. And I was reminded, by listening to some of the podcasts, I always think it's sort of a challenge to, when you're telling a story, of what part of your story you're going to tell, or what story am I going to tell today. And there's a lovely story of an old monk who, every time they go past a mirror, they wink at the reflection in there and go, "So, you old rogue, who are you going to be today?" or something, you know. Because I think what I've discovered, and part of the trans journey for me, is how our life is a gradual uncovering, as it were, or entering into a deeper mystery about ourselves. So what we say about, you know, one part of ourselves, there's always sort of that affirms things I've said, but also hides a lot of other things, you know, that come to fruition or whatever. So, and that's certainly been partly my trans journey, I suppose. You know, some of those things were buried, were hidden. I didn't have the language for when I was younger. But they've, you know, gradually emerged, and it all makes sense and gives me a greater sense of fulfillment and flourishing, I think, which is part of what I seek for myself and others.
Yeah, that is all such wonderful stuff. I remember in the email you mentioned sort of that stuff about living into mystery, and I love that so much. Especially, like, I found that article online where you had an interview a couple years ago. So was it only just a couple years ago that you came out to the Anglican Church?
It's a bit of a thing. I mean, the Anglican Church, Episcopal Church in the USA, I mean, we've made quite a few steps. And, you know, my psychologist will tell me, "You're quite fortunate," he says, "because you are in one of the more liberal churches." And I say, well, yes, it doesn't feel like that a lot of the time. But it's a bit of a struggle. So, yes, we have that. There's a whole story there about, you know, how you negotiate that. And sadly, you know, as you know, for trans people in most or many circumstances today, we still have to negotiate these things, which is sort of crazy, really, isn't it? But yes, that was a couple of years ago. Although I'd been on hormones and other things, but actually coming out and then being in the spotlight of things. Because in Australia, in the Anglican Church, I mean, we're a bit of a mix generally, which might come back to. But in Australia, in general, we have the richest, most powerful Anglican diocese in the world in Sydney, and that's a lot to do with history. And they are, you know, deeply conservative, reformed church. So if they could find a way to get rid of me, I think they would. But God is good.
Yeah, and that's such a hard spot to be in, where you know that there are people in this community, in your church, that should be about sort of sharing and bringing life to each other, and knowing that some of them would have you leave if they could. It's so difficult. So it's beautiful that you've been able to stay and be that voice. And I know your wife is she also a priest? I saw she's also...
Yes. But I mean, she was in the first wave of women who were ordained in England. So we went through that sort of struggle with the ordination of women and things. Wow, and also, I think she was the second woman to take maternity leave as a priest. Okay. And we as a couple, we were quite unusual. So yes, it's sort of, I thought we'd done all the pioneering bit that we were going.
How long ago was that y'all had to fight for women to be priests?
Oh, it's about now, I think, it's in England, I think the first priests were ordained in 1994, in Australia in 1992, in the USA a little early. So it's been a bit of a journey, but, you know, the battle throughout, you know, our theological college and everything else. And I do chuckle now about it a little bit, because the Bishop of London, who ordained both Penny actually as well as deacon, went off to join the Catholic Church because he couldn't cope with the. But I do sort of think it's quite funny, really, that he did ordain. Well, he might have ordained others, I don't know, but he did ordain a female in me. You know, it was quite an uncomfortable time, and I felt really very uncomfortable actually forward for ordination. In the end, I did, because I decided it was best to have an extra vote, house of clergy sort of thing. You know. Yes. But when they were struggling, and, you know, then they went to and fro about things, and at the final vote that went through, I mean, if they hadn't passed that, I would have stepped back and only worked as a deacon, because it was sort of unjust, really. And it was doing violence to myself, because, although I hadn't fully articulated, my gender identity at that stage, because I grew up in a little rural community in England, and had a lovely family life in a way, but it was really quite conservative, and in various different ways. And when I was, it's a familiar story of people my age, really. Gay people, it was illegal to do anything, really, never mind sexual expression. So I just didn't have the language for a long time. So I guess part of what I feel as a priest and as a preacher, I suppose, is really helping people to explore, to find the language that we have in ourselves, to enable people to find their voice and their identity.
I think I saw a quote from you where you were telling other Anglican clergy that you feel like finally coming out as trans and being open about it is going to enrich your priesthood.
Yes.
Do you want to give some examples for how you have felt your priesthood and your ministry enriched?
That's what I say. I think there might be a turning point here in Australia. I don't know how it is in the USA, but I think for so long, gay people as well, but trans people have put, the sort of the clobber text and all that sort of, the Catholic theology, intrinsically disordered, all that sort of very badly constructed natural law theology and everything. We fought those things, as it were, and we've had to apologise for ourselves. And I felt that's not right, because I want to give voice, if you like, to use an old Protestant expression, to the gospel that's within me, the faith that's within me. And so I want to say, I want to celebrate, and we have this thing in the church, there's welcoming churches, which usually aren't. There's inclusive ones, which are sort of inclusive. I don't just want to be included, and usually it means, we won't really address your real issues and things. And then there's affirming, which is better. But I think I want to get to celebrating.
Yes, amen.
And I look at things, and it's flourishing. I call my website, Trans Spirit Flourishing, because that's what I think it is, and that's where I think if we shifted, I find the Bible comes alive for me, particularly in things like, when Jesus said, "By their fruits you shall know them." So, what are the fruits? Can you see in the lives of trans? This is the thing for me at the end of the day. We can argue about, whether or not our brains are constructed in this way, or hormones, or whatever, and that's important for people to do that research. But at the end of the day, are we bearing fruits that show, love, justice, peace, and all that sort of thing, patience? That's a difficult one for me. But are those things coming alive? And I see that. It isn't for everyone, is it? But on the whole, transport, for one thing, quite a few of us are alive and we wouldn't otherwise be. So that's pretty good stuff. And then all the other things, and so. And that's exciting for other people. And the more I read it, I'm hardly, the most innovative people in a way, but I do pick up things and communicate them. But, the stories in a lot of the stories in the Bible, the New Testament at least, they're about, free people stepping out into a new space, leaving darkness to light, the Nicodemus stuff, he's stuck there, he won't come out. And I think that's, for me, is a gift, that trans people are a gift to the church. Because, and we're not the only one, but because we embody the possibility of that transformation, of giving people courage, even if we haven't we've lots of hidden for so long sometimes, and the possibility of people being who they are. Because you walk around, lots of people in churches and in the world generally, they're often sort of quite depressed, because they're not achieving what they would like. When they were a little kid, they wanted to be an artist or something, and they end up being a accountant. There's nothing wrong with accountancy as such, but if what your soul longs for is not met, eventually you're going to wither, aren't you? And that's my story, and I think that's story for for a lot of straight people as well. So if they were to sort of see that and that we change, that's a scary thing for people. But I believe that the heart of Buddha is about transformation. And lots of people have written about that. Richard Raw and other people have, written books and other things about this. But if you look at it in the interfaith, it's all about transformation, isn't it? With Buddhism or Hinduism, and Islam in the same way, and of transformation from what was to what might become, or what for some people might be regarded as core, the base of who we are, sort of thing. And so the various religions, for me, are ways into enabling transformation and holding it together, because it's, as we know, if you transition, it's quite a scary thing, because all sorts of things can be lost, including your own sense of identity and purpose. So sometimes it's helpful. That's the way I see it with church. Church is there to help everyone, as it were, to transition into being, or to trans into being whatever they are. And I don't want to imperialize it, but I think if people saw it that way, you'd start to see that we're not just to be tolerated, or we're just, the image of God is in us and isn't that nice, and we'll go on with usual business. We have a group which I'm involved in here, which is called Equal Voices, which is our sort of national LGBTQA body of Christians and allies and stuff. And we've got to think about, an equal place at the table, which I agree with. But I quite like to change the table as well. If we're at the table, we might want to extend it and do it differently. Do you know what I mean? Or have different food, or talk differently.
Yeah. So we're not just guests at the table, we're having an actual impact on the table.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And there's a, interchange of things. And then, then that's that, then we move beyond the binaries and move beyond the boxes that we put one another in, really. I'm quite fortunate, really. The Anglican Church is really, and across the world, is sort of quite extraordinary, and it's got some really horrendous elements in it. Somehow it's sort of got, it's given me space to be who I am. Do you know what I mean? To thrive. And as a priest, I do worry sometimes with churches, and myself in the past, whether or not it's a bit like living in a, an abusive marriage or something, and they give you just enough promise or enough sort of nice things to keep you in, but I don't think I do ultimately that. So, coming back to what we said before, I think there's a lot of people, and trans people amongst them, that I would say are part of, if you look at theologically, a part of what you might say the new exodus today, exile people in a way, who come out of, and some of us are building new communities, so we are entering, new spaces and creating, and we need to, because we can't just live in the wilderness forever. But that's the core story. It's the big stories of the Bible. I think if you're going to be a Christian, I really don't want to stay as a trans person in the church and be, a tolerated element or even an included element. So I find going back to the stories, they come alive in fresh ways, and that's really exciting. Once we use our eyes to read the Bible, just as women start to read the Bible, and then the stories make different sense. Just as when Black people have read them, the stories come alive in a different way. Sometimes quite challenging for other people, but quite liberating.
Yeah, absolutely. Just going back to what you said about sometimes worrying that staying in the church is like staying in an abusive relationship. I think so many people can resonate that, because so many of us have been hurt by these communities. And yet you have found value in Anglicanism. One thing that you mentioned in your email is seeing something poetic and non-binary about Anglicanism. And I would love to hear about that.
Yes. Well, a few folk have written about it. One of the interesting things in my different strands of Anglicans, but a lot of, is that there are quite a lot of poets associated with Anglicanism, and I think it has that kind of a character that doesn't mean, and good poetry in a sense is, it has structure, so it's not like it's sort of anything goes, just throw a lot of words out there. So it has a structure and a rhythms to things, but it can take slightly different forms and things. But I think unlike prose, which is very, very ordered and doesn't really leave room for mystery and things. Good poetry breaks things open, both, as it were, in a sort of a way offers great images, sometimes great poetry. And R.S. Thomas, the great Welsh Anglican poet, was a bit like this. Would speak about darkness and silence and things, and take us, to sort of take us beyond the sort of the froth of the world into other spaces from which, this, new things can emerge, and the depth of mystery and things. So I think that's, and that's been part of my sort of journey, absolutely, and poetry, and it's a particular sensibility, I suppose. For me, it's also linked to, some of my sort of Celtic background and that sort of maybe romanticism as well. But I think Anglicanism it's quite legally constructed as well. So it's sort of a balance between realism and romanticism, I think. But as a non-binary, I mean, I was struck. I was at a conference earlier in the year, National LGBTQA conference, and somebody was talking about and some religious folk. So, because one of the interesting things that seems to me lately is that in this, the religious folk were asked to speak because some queer folk have caught on that actually we maybe need to listen to some of the people of faith who are queer as well. Because actually, some of us actually may be doing it worse, in fact, than other people, because we're still in the monster, sort of thing. But also, we might have things to say. So these people were talking about that, and I was struck by that. And they were sort of, it was quite strongly Protestant and Pentecostal people speaking, and also some Catholics. And they were talking these things and were saying these things. And I thought, well, I don't sort of really quite, I mean, I sort of resonate with bits of what I'm saying, but actually, you're not really telling my story too much. And then it suddenly struck me how Anglicanism really, in a way, is a sort of a non-binary. If denominations had genders, my sort of Anglicanism is sort of, well, yes and no for certain things. I mean, I'm not a non-binary person, so I can, but the way I sort of sense that there are things we draw, we can identify with in difference of both Catholicism and the Reformed tradition. But at the heart of it is that we're Catholic and Reformed, and we've been a lot of other things like that. We're both liturgical, but we're proclamatory as well and all that. But I think where we've got to now, this is what I'm trying to say to some people in our church, is that, well, if we're basically Catholic and Reformed, then our DNA is, well, non-binary. So you can both be Catholic. You can be Catholic and Reformed, or Catholic and Reformed, or beyond Catholic and Reformed. So what is the problem like with people if they sort of identify with, why do we have to squeeze ourselves into one model of one binary, as it were, or box of things?
Oh, that is such a good way of imagining it. I don't know about, probably not in places like England, but in the United States, a lot of people sort of we remember that Protestants exist, and we remember that Catholics exist. Anglicans are an afterthought. An Orthodox Christian, we forget they exist, and so we really do have this binary. Where we forget, just like in our thoughts about gender, we remember that men and women exist and forget everyone who don't. If you don't fit just one of those boxes, you're forgotten. You're not part of the conversation. So yeah, I love that analogy. That works really, really well.
Yes, that's right. And I think it's kind of just a bit bewildering, and you can't quite place us. I think that people, if you don't know how to place people, it's very different. But I think and then there's a few other groups, aren't there, that don't quite fit in that sort of way. And I do think, as you're aware, I mean, it's not where trans women and men are really, but there's always that danger, and I worried a little bit about that, if I come and living as a woman, whether or not I was just, how much I reinforce the binary in a way. Sometimes, so people say, oh, well, okay, as long as you behave like a woman, then that's fine. Now we can relax again. But I don't want people to relax. I want people still to still want to stir them up. Do you know what I mean? Not because of my gender, because that in really particularly, or if that's a way of doing it, I suppose that's the way it's doing. But continually provoke people and say, well, don't ask it, instead of asking questions about, well, who are you and you're a problem? Well, how about looking at yourself? So as I say, look at that and saying, what is my calling? What is the mystery in me? Is there more to me than given credit for? And are there things that I need to not hold on to so much? Because I do think, you've met a lot of them, I expect, hopefully not had too much to do with them, but some of these very deeply reactionary people, some of them have things inside themselves. It's the only way I can understand some of this, the deep, because it's so visceral, isn't it? The opposition to us in many ways. It's more than anything rational. And some of it has got to be for some of those people that there's things in their life they have not resolved. And it's not necessarily that they're trans or gay or anything. It might be something else. But I think they feel if they accept this at all and you take one brick out of the wall, all of this will come falling out. And it's our job, I suppose. Well, it's not our job, but at the end of the day, they're never going to be free if they're walled up in some sort of horrendous prison.
Yeah, and I think that's always a difficult conversation to have, is to recognize that our oppressors are also in many ways oppressing themselves, because they're forcing themselves into the same kind of boxes that they force us into. And it's not to say that they deserve our sympathy or our pity, or that their lives are worse than ours, but it's just to say that if they can figure out how to, fix their views about us and see things better for us, they're also going to help themselves too in the long run.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's that funny thing, isn't there, that people have got, I mean, as I say, I'm English background. I've got this weird thing at the moment, in Britain, there's, where they want to leave European community and everything. And this sort of idea that if you give anything to anyone else, you lose. Allow people space to be. You lose, instead of sovereignty or life being something you accumulate. So this sort of idea, that if someone's allowed to be who they really are, or to be married, for instance, the marriage thing, because we've still got that in our church here, equal marriage, that somehow it sort of reduces the value of us, which is sort of very weird, isn't it? Now it is a political thing as well in that sense. It's that. So if we try and build up Ireland or France or Germany or whatever as British people, helping, then somehow that's diminishing Britain. But it isn't, is it? It's actually enriching, because you've got stronger partnerships and everything else. So that's back to the thing about the flourishing, the gift of trans people, is that if we were fully affirmed, not just included, affirmed and celebrated, then that would actually enrich people's lives. I mean, we have one or two people here, because we've now got married Anglican people, thank God, but they're not allowed to be married in our church in Australia. But people started having, so they can't have a service, but often one or two parishes around here, they'll have parties for people, and they're absolutely fabulous. And and I saw some lovely photos of some people in Newcastle who got married, a gay couple, friend of mine, and they were saying, most of the people at the wedding there, and it was beautiful and it was fabulous celebration, and they said most of the people at this party were straight people, and it's all a Jesus thing, isn't it, really? Because I mean, Jesus was big on the party. What is one of his major images for the kingdom of God is the banquet, the feast, the party, and and the people who were supposed to come didn't turn up because they were too snooty about it, but the invitation to people, so yeah. I mean, you're quite right. There's not a lot of pointers doing much with these horrendous reactionary people, apart from putting up a big stop sign and thing. And I think we have to have, it's the two hands of non-violence, they call it, another hand which sort of offers a way forward, and that's a bit difficult because it can get stamped on, I think. But really, most of the time, we need to be dealing with our stuff and creating, well, not creating, but nurturing the beloved community, with the banquets and everything else, and that's what communicates to people, and that's back to the Anglicanism with the poetry a little bit, is that, poetry at its best can also be a way into beauty through words, music. Words are more my thing than music and I really admire that. But that's sort of part of our tradition. The Catholics have got it a little bit, the Protestants sort of pushed away some of those things. But, to sort of help people, if you can help people see beauty, they will respond to that as well as other things. And people won't change, other people won't change unless we are able to offer something that is inviting, and transformational. And certainly it isn't sort of saying the clever texts are wrong or something. That really won't get us anywhere. But if we can talk about and embody as well, and create, communities that are, they are really hospitable and flourishing and, fun as well.
Yeah.
A lot of churches aren't, are they? Let's face it, they're quite sort of dour and dowdy. And that's the, I don't mean the really reactionary ones. I mean some of the other ones, they sort of, they come to worship God, but, you're not really fully letting go. You'd want to, if you're going to have a party for anyone, you'd try and do something creative, wouldn't you? But often, you come to worship and have a party with God, and it's sort of often the same thing.
I am part of the Presbyterians, which are known as the Frozen Chosen. So it takes a lot. It takes a lot to get us moving and dancing. And I think a lot of times what it is finding new ways to celebrate God and new ways to see God. The way we do that is inviting people who are transgender, who are queer, people who are enriching the story that, we've spent so long reading the Bible from this white and cis male lens. The more that we expand that, the more we're going to find worth celebrating about God. So along with showing them that we can have a good time, we can also offer this new image of God that's not the old white man who it's sort of like Santa Claus up in the clouds watching you and punishing you or rewarding you, you know? We have a God who's something bigger than that, which I think is a good time to transition to another thing you mentioned in your email, which was God as always transitioning,
Yes.
which I'm so excited to hear about.
Yes. Well, someone, I don't know when I got it. It was one of these little that got on transitioning. And I think, yes, that for me is spot on in a way, in terms of our experience of God. Now, I'm not saying, because, you know, I teach theology and things, so I have to be a little bit careful. But, you know, the Orthodox tradition of sort of God, you know, they made a distinction between what you might call the essence of God in God's self, you know, which is sort of beyond our imagination and mystery, everything else. And that sort of never changes. That's sort of like a bottom line for, you know, because there's something. But in terms of the energies of God, which is what we experience, that's dynamic. Well, I mean, I'm not saying the essence of God isn't dynamic in God's self. That's sort of into Trinitarian theology. But the energies of how we experience God is always changing, and God is always expressed. You know, because if you see one of my great heroes is a straight man, but quite a remarkable priest, Irish priest, poet, philosopher called John O'Donoghue, and one of the things he used to say was, once you see God as an artist, it could be a poet or musician, whatever. Once you see God as an artist, everything changes, because and we have, he said, so much emphasized the will of God to the detriment of the imagination of God. And I think, I'm sure there's things to be said eventually about will and judgment and everything, but we need to leave those aside. And so people do see God in a sort of a fixed way, whereas actually God is more like an artist, or I would even say God is like art, you know, which is well, I mean, what is art? Well, you know, art is truth, beauty, and all those sort of things we talked about. But also it's something we participate in, but might be expressed in very different ways, you know. So, I mean, I see the stories of, you know, as I'm sure you do, the stories of creation as they are sort of works of art, aren't they? You know, the you know, Genesis 1, for instance, you know, which some people try and use as some sort of constitutional layout of a mechanics book of how the world was constructed or something. It's actually a poem, really, and possibly a liturgical poem, and it's and it's a beautiful way of, you know, that God of as it were, the divine mystery evolves in society. And I don't know all about, you know, all the ins and outs of science, whatever. But I think the image of evolution in a way, or evolving at least, is a beautiful one, because I think that's the way. So that, and how would you picture that? Well, I think we might picture it, one of the ones is to picture it as trans or transing. So rather than sort of like a trans person. So I mean, we could talk, I mean, I think this case, we could come back to that, could talk about, people have, haven't they, about Jesus as transgender in some way. But I'd want to get beyond that into sort of like God as a whole, in that dynamic sense. You know, God is a verb rather than a noun. So God is like art, is transient. So everything is always, in a way, transitioning or never being able to be contained. So our churches, in a way, when we build walls, especially in Australia, sometimes we have these windows as well in the old churches, and they're also like old stained glass windows, because that's what they had in Europe, so that would be nice. But of course, they miss out on this amazing landscape and everything that we have in Australia. So you're shutting out. You also mean you're putting God in a box, whereas God is in the landscape and everything. And whereas, you know, the Taizé community had some dealings with, and they had that they used to have. Part of their church was sort of open on one side. Sometimes, you know, put a screen up or something to keep the rain out. But the point was that it was the dynamic of the provisional, is what they talked about. Is that God is always dynamic, so you can't restrict God to a box. So if a church is constructed, however beautiful the thing is, it's got, you know, it's bounded by that. Whereas God is always sort of at the edges of things, and so those who are on the margins, typically, and that seems to me the story in the Bible a lot. They're the ones through whom God works, you know, not because they're necessarily, you know, not so in that sense of trans people. It's not that we're more wonderful than anybody else, but it's because where we are today in our journeys, and, you know, socially, politically, culturally, and everything, we're in a position where we can be the bearers of the new, you know, the new art, whatever, you know, the new picture of how we might be human beings together. But that's quite complicated. So God's always in danger of being excluded, don't you think, from not just churches and everything. I mean, from our own lives, you know, where we settle for less. Really, we settle for the for our own boxes that someone's constructed for us, or we construct for ourselves, because it brings us power and wealth or whatever. But then you've given up, I suppose, the art and the beauty and the possibility of change. So yeah, I think if we saw God as transing, because maybe that's better than trans, because people start to say, well, Jesus didn't look like this or whatever. If it's trying to take people beyond that into every aspect of life, then it might be one helpful way forward anyway, to find there's new metaphors, new language for exploring mystery today, and affirming and celebrating what's actually happening, what God is doing, which is usually or often outside the church, but it does happen in the church as well. And I suppose we, as theologians, we're in a place where we're not exactly, hopefully we're more than art critics, we're actually artists as well, but we actually help people to see what is actually being created, what this transing mystery of God is about, really.
Yeah, I really you're throwing so many beautiful images of God at me, like that God isn't just an artist, that God is art. It's so powerful when we think of just what art can be, and like how we do all interpret it so differently, and that doesn't mean that there's only one right way. And then just you saying like God is in danger of being excluded a lot. That's
I think that's I mean, I think I was thinking about what we said earlier about how we communicate and how we portray God as well. And I think that is at the risk of being sort of racist, my own thing. But I think is that people from other than white cultures sometimes have aspects of a greater embodiment in the way in which they do theology, worship, life, and stuff. What you were saying, because a lot of it's interesting because most Anglicans now are African or something else, but Sudanese, because we've got a lot of mixture of peoples here, and the Sudanese find it quite strange because we're so bound. We don't move, and we're all in our heads and everything. And our Aboriginal people and Torres Strait people, and it's about movement and dance, and they also think, and they can write as well. But our theology is done through the body, and maybe that's another gift I think of trans people in that, because we're saying that whereas our bodies are problematized by people, because they're not right, they're fallen or broken, it's awful sort of terminology, but actually we're saying no, in fact this is how God is made alive in us. That's what. So I'm flourishing now, but through my body, and I mean, I don't know how it was part of the journey, wasn't it? When people used to talk about being born in the wrong body or something, and people said to me, so that means you're born in the wrong body, you've always thought you're born in. I said, no, not really. I feel my life, my transitioning and everything, but broader than just my gender, is that I'm incarnating. That's which is central image of God, is that I'm gradually becoming more human. That's part of the task of the church, rather than sort of talking about becoming like God. A lot of the time our problem is actually becoming more human. So, and in my case, part of that was my transitioning, so that I feel I enter into what my body should be, not because like there's one male body and a female body and I need to get out of one box and into another, but because there's some aspects of myself I've always been happy with, but others not. So why not change that in alignment? So that sort of body theology of incarnation, you can apply that to a wider world, such as say the body politic or something, and saying, well, it's not that we need to jump out completely from one sort of state of economy or something to another, but but this economy is constraining us and what's name, and we don't need to get to politics. That's what I think. And so we need to change things in the economy in order that we nurture shalom, we flourish better.
Yeah.
And again, that's a transing. So how does the economy as it were? How does it trans into something else? And that's a lot of the time, we've just had an election which sadly didn't go the way a lot of people wanted. And that's part because lots of people in my state and further north were attached to a sort of a model that were frightened because they felt that the only way forward was, to do more and more mining and things like that. But because there was no other way forward, or they hadn't yet evolved, they couldn't see how they could live differently, even though they know this model, this body, that economy they live in isn't it doesn't work for them anymore, and it's actually destructive for them as well as other people. But how do you live in a body that, where you do live at peace with the earth and all the other things, and your gifts, instead of digging things out of the earth, you're creating something beautiful, and not can be a builder of wonderful structures or something, or communities and things like that, which are a lot of less intellectual people have a lot of have capacity to do, to create beautiful things, rather than just be workers in a profit-making machine sort of thing, which is what we're. I hadn't expected into economy. How did I dress? Connect, I think that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Gifts of transparent. I mean, I do think that's why we're quite offensive to a lot of people, is because you have to say, really, honestly, there aren't that many of us. I mean, I know there's more and more coming out, thank God, but we reach a point where we're only a fragment of the population, and we're a bit of a mix, really, aren't we? Because we argue amongst ourselves if we would.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think so it can't be our numbers or anything like that. But I think it's because we challenge people with what actually deep down everybody knows, is that the system doesn't work, our bodies don't work, our world doesn't work unless we concentrate on the things that really matter. And I suppose in our own way, at some stage, we've had to make a choice between life and death, in a way, between what will be life-giving and what will be death-dealing, and that's, in a way, and it's a profound spiritual religious thing, I think.
And I love how you sort of branch off and start talking about the economy and politics, because it shows how you see being trans as sort of fitting into a whole variety of aspects of life, instead of it only being about the things that people who are offended by us see, which is that we're just medically transitioning and that's the whole story, when it's not at all. There's so much more to it, especially because some of us don't transition medically for a whole variety of reasons. And so realizing like that's part of it, but there's so much more to it, and that it really can be something we bring out into our whole life and into our communities is really cool to hear about.
For me, that's it. I mean, I've always felt, I think it is for gay people as well, but I've always felt strongly that there is, with a small s, because I don't like to imperialize other people's life, but that a lot of our journey is, as you've said, it's not people, a lot of people think it's a body thing, and I think it's as much as actually a spirit thing. And that's in a lot of trans. I went at one stage a few years ago, and it was sort of one of the watersheds in my life, to a sort of, well, it was more like cross between a conference and a party thing, really, for a retreat thing. My wife said, she came with me, and she said there was all these trans people there at various different sort of steps of the journey and things, and she said it was a bit like a retreat, a religious retreat. People were doing so much personal work, about who they were and how they related to other people and how they could bear with suffering and challenge and courage and a whole lot of other things, and all the sort of virtues of religious, spiritual virtues, and doing all of those things. And we were sort of like together, we all were doing our own stuff in a way, but we were also helping one another. Now, I wouldn't want to overstate the thing, because thank God there was a lot of fun and what's the name thing, but actually reflecting theologically, that's what was happening. And I think that's what we do in general. That's what I've experienced with trans people, is that we are actually serious, maybe isn't the right word, but we are really quite, we have to do that deep down work in a way that maybe it is because of the body, but it's actually, I think it's much more than that, and people don't really understand that, and people think we're obsessed with the flesh, as it were, when in fact about the spirit, they're the ones that look at the flesh. Really, does it matter who's got what genitals and everything else? But they're hung up on it, whereas we're sort of wanting to look at the big things, all those, the things the things of the spirit, really.
Yeah, I agree with you that we're often doing the spiritual work because we can't avoid it. Yes. Other people sometimes can avoid it, and we have to face it head on, and find out, like, I think we definitely become concerned with the body, and I don't think that's, like you said, embodying spirituality is not a bad thing.
No,
before I realized I was queer, I grew up Catholic, and so I had read all these old saints who would, sort of hurt their flesh and avoid their flesh and fast and stuff, because they saw flesh as completely evil and negative and against the spirit. I was forced to reconsider, well, maybe flesh can be used for the spirit, that these two things can be intertwined.
Yeah.
Not just my own flesh, but a whole body of Christ.
Yes.
That we're all connected socially, spiritually, physically.
Yes.
And I never would have done that work if I were not queer, and
Yes.
especially trans. Yeah.
That's right. And it's a beautiful gift, isn't it? I mean, your story, because you've done that point of view, so there's things you can see, and, I mean, I'm sure that you would say, you may be in a Presbyterian box in one sense of the moment, but you're still Catholic. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And so there's things to say, because I think, there's, in a way, in the ultimate sense of things, though denominations obviously don't mean anything, but what's valuable in them, in the Catholic tradition, I'm sure that you would say, you may be in a Presbyterian box in one sense of the moment, but you're still Catholic. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And so there's things to say, because I think, there's, in a way, in the ultimate sense of things, though denominations obviously don't mean anything, but what's valuable in them, in the Catholic tradition, in that sense, that's important to me in Orthodox, is that, some of the great, what's called dogmas or doctrines of the Church, I mean, they're intensely queer, aren't they? I mean, the Virgin Birth. Wow.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Can anybody be someone who claims to be, we want to defend Christian orthodoxy, and they're defending the Virgin Birth, they're defending, and the pictures, all that sort of stuff. I mean, I know you probably talked about this with people before, but, all of those great things, how you can be one, you can be both human and divine. So what's he talking about? Two natures. So how can you be that? I mean, what on earth are we worried about non-binary if that's at the heart of our faith, that Jesus, in some sense, is beyond all of that?
Yes. He came and he broke through all the most important binaries.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, of creator versus creation, and then life versus death.
Yes.
He just came and plowed right through those. So why are we so tied up on what's in people's pants? And yeah. And I think it's scary that because we're born into these societies where we're steeped in these ideas that like these things do matter and they're just how things are. And so when you realize that you can think bigger, it's scary.
Yes, that's right. And which is another aspect of transing, you see, because, the words about some of our folk in the Anglican Church in Australia, I mean, they're big on the Reformation, and they want to go back to the Reformation, which is a bit weird, really, when you think about it, because, as you know, from the Presbyterian point of view, the point about the Reformation was that it was about change. I mean, I know they will look back, look at the what's name, but they changed all sorts of things, especially when it comes to marriage and things. I mean, it was a radical revolution, and you put things into the language of the people and all that sort of thing. So you're taking seriously the new learning of the time. So why aren't we doing that? So I think what they're talking about, the deformation actually of the thing. But I was thinking about this further, and actually I thought, in fact, what we need is, and I'm playing with words a bit here, but we don't want a reformation, nor do we want the deformation, but we want a transformation, which is not, and the word is important because it's not in a way, because is just going back as if there was an ideal past and everything was pure in the first centuries of the church, and I teach that. And one of my the best students I ever had the first year, and they said, "Oh, I'm so disappointed by this course." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Because," and I thought, "Oh no," and I've done something wrong. And they said, "No," they said it was because they discovered that there was no perfect time when the church. But we still have that idea when we think about a reformation, reformation. But trans is beyond, isn't it? That's what I was saying. Yeah. For all of us, it's a calling to us to go beyond what we already are, and that would worry me a little bit with some trans people. If that's hopefully, if people need to do surgical transition or whatever else, they get all that out of it. But that they don't stop thinking that now, now they've arrived. I read looking at some about a few years ago, and about gender surgery. Male to female, and people are talking about crossing the finishing line, and I'm thinking, isn't it? As a human being, you cross because you've had a back to the flesh. You've had an operation of the flesh that somehow you've been, which is not to deny what we've said about the embodied, but you'd sort of hope that as a trans person, you somehow learn how to trans a bit.
Yes, yeah.
transing and encourage other people to trans, which doesn't mean to say you shouldn't just, that hopefully you've reached a state of peace, because that, that's what I said before about, what I've said to people about, my journey is that, I think I'm a better priest. I'm definitely a better, spouse, lover, and think to my wife and to, parents and everything. But I'm in better in myself because I've got peace, because I spent a lot of my life running, literally from one place to another to avoid God, in that. And you're hiding from God, and it's very sad, really.
I like that a lot, that idea that, like, the Presbyterian and the Reformed motto is to be reformed and always being reformed. But I like it the way you're thinking, being transformed, and always being transformed.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's
that it should be continuous.
Yes, that's right. And I'm not saying, the past is important, because, that, back to our story, and people have different experience, don't they? But, I would, I don't regret a lot of things that, that's the thing a lot of trans people say. I don't regret a lot of things that happened in my former life, as it were. And I don't like people using my old name and things. But, there's stuff you draw on and things that give you life there, really, a little bit. But Luther's thing, isn't it? Well, didn't he say something like, we're to be semper reformandum, always reforming? Yes. And that's what, really, it's transformation. He said that's that dynamic sense of faith, that, and sadly, not perhaps Calvin, but I think some of the Calvinists and so on turned it into systematized that, in a way that Luther certainly didn't intend, and I don't think Calvin did really at best. I think he wanted to, help people enter into the mystery, and the light beyond the darkness and all that sort of thing.
We've talked about so much great stuff, and I think on your list of themes you wanted to sort of cover, I think we've gotten to at least kind of visit quite a few of them.
Yes. I'd say they sort of interconnect, really, in a way.
Yes.
I think.
Yeah.
And my own personal story. I said before, and I threw that out, really, but I have done a lot of running in the past, and it is sort of like one place to another. But I've had to cross a lot of boundaries, really, in my life. And emigration was one of them. That was another big, and that slowed me up, because I was coming out of it. But my children got ill, so long story, but we had to move to Australia, and which has been a beautiful thing on all sorts of different levels. But we were back to starting again. My wife had a job, I didn't have a job. I was looking after the kids, I think. So I've sort of put things on hold. But that was an interesting experience. And obviously coming from England to Australia is not such a big cultural shift as some, but it is a shift on lots of things when you're given all your contacts and things. So there's, but I did a lot of work on ecumenical work. I worked for the National Council of Churches in Australia, and then and interfaith work as well. And with the National Council of Church, I also did quite a lot of work with Australian reconciliation, trying to bring together, white Christians and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Christians and others. And so a lot of that has been sort of, I realised in my life that because when I was younger, I had to live in one, as it were, in one culture, the male, even though I didn't really identify with that. But that I spent lots of time trying to interpret for men things that I didn't really understand, and that's why I think I've probably, and others have said this, some other trans priests have said this, is that in a way that's a bit of a gift if you're in a congregation, because you're speaking to a lot of people who are not the same as you. And so if you've had the experience of standing in a place, doing that sort of interpretation, and it gives you those sort of gifts. And even today, when I do quite a bit of work with our sort of reconciliation action plan chair in our diocese, working with Aboriginal people, trying to improve situations. And I find one of the things I've been struck lately by the fact that when I've been in gatherings with Aboriginal people, white people, of noticing much more through my queer journey as well, that the sort of things that happen to us, the way in which we're treated and not respected, or we're silenced, or people interpret us and whatever, is exactly what very similar, it's not exactly the same. It's very similar to what white people do to Aboriginal and Islander people. And we think we interpret, or we think we hear what people are saying, and we're not actually hearing at all. And so it's quite humbling to do this work, because I realised, you know, there's this, then I have to, you know, it's sort of challenging. You know, I realise how, you know, my whiteness is actually getting in the way, you know, so, which is sort of quite good, because sometimes I think, you know, as queer people, we can get, there's a tendency sometimes, you know, I sort of, in some parts of the community, to get a little bit self-righteous about things.
Yeah.
In fact, well, you know, obviously, if you're black or other characteristics of you make it more complicated, and that it is, it really does need to be an intersectional approach, and that, you know, I'm increasingly aware of how white, you know, the mainstream queer community is in Australia, and an effort's been made, and it's changing slowly. But, you know, I think it's true that the greatest proportion of gender diverse people in Australia are actually in the Tiwi Islands. You know, they're part of the Aboriginal community there, and which is a bit of a shock to a lot of white people, you know, conservative white people, because they think that, you know, it's being trans is some sort of modern or postmodern, you know, white Western people. But in fact, of course, it's, you know, embodied in lots of culture, and especially in Australia, you know, because we've got so many Pacific Islanders and Asian people, is that, you know, we realised that actually white Western culture is the problem, and that, you know, that, so, and that's part of, I suppose that's part of the, I'm going off the tangent here a little bit, aren't I? But I mean, it's part of that transing again for me, is that, you know, well, yeah, I've completed this stage of my journey, as it were, or completed it, but you know, I've been on, but there's other aspects of learning, and the things that I've learned as a trans person might resonate with other things. So that maybe I need now to, I mean, we still have to stick up for ourselves a lot and things, but we also need to build good, you know, good solidarity with other people, especially those who, you know, probably doing it a lot worse than people like myself, or, you know, in a job and things like that.
Yeah, that is a big issue in the United States as well, that a lot of LGBT organizations, even if they don't, you know, they don't realize it, but it's so white-centered.
Yes.
Yeah. It is interesting to hear in Australia how that sort of, there's differences and similarities.
And it's complicated, isn't it? I mean, we've got at the moment, we had a very good, very fine footballer, rugby player, and he sort of has issued some things on social media, you know, condemnatory things about people, including homosexuals, and, you know, contractual issue and other things, and it's been blown up in the media. But he's a Pacific Islander, and so it's complicated because he's, you know, a committed Christian, whatever, and not obviously not on a lot of theology, from other things he said. But he would say that this, you know, the people want to sort of shut him up and everything. But he's saying, well, this is actually an attack on Pacific Islanders, you know, because many of them are Christian. So you've got that, it's mixed in, isn't it? I mean, sometimes it's the fault of Western imperialism that we went and taught people all these awful things, and now it's coming back to bite. White folk, like in the Anglican Church, you know, the Africans were taught this, that, and the other, and now a lot of them are saying, you know, well, you know, you're the ones who are now off beam. But it's on people like, you know, in the Pacific, because, you know, we've got close relationship there. You know, Fa'afafini and people like that, gender diverse people for whom culture, the Pacific culture, is not a problem at all. But it's when they step inside a church, even if Pacific Islander led is problematic. So thank God there are, you know, people, but those voices, I think, need to be heard more and more, you know.
Absolutely. And do you think, so one thing I think you mentioned in your email is that you've been elected as a representative to the Synod in Australia. Do you think that's sort of one of the issues that needs to be discussed more? And what are you planning to do or have already done?
Yes, well, it's a big step in a way. Well, it's not a big, but in a way, it's like the moon landing, isn't it? It's a small step for whatever trans people, but I think it's a step forward, and it's quite affirming for me, you know, because when I first came out, I thought, you know, it was difficult, you know, maybe they would get rid of me or whatever. So it's an affirmation from my area of the church, so it puts me into a space which, you know, where I'm visible. I mean, I stood partly because and for some, I mean, I wouldn't put lots of people, but I think trans people, we do have to stand up, and Because if we don't stand up and say things, then then we're just ignored. So next year we have they're going to have a conference. It's all slightly vague at the moment, but about sexuality and marriage and things. And so I'm really glad to be officially on that box. It'll be harder for them to keep me out of that. And we've had this thing, and the bishops have talked a lot in our church and in our country, but they haven't really talked to other people. And then they had a doctrine commission group that wrote a book that's just come out about sexuality and marriage and things. But I mean, maybe one or two of them are closeted queer people, I don't know. But they have 8 or 9 writers, and every single none of them are, identified queer person.
Oh,
and you
wow.
think, what is happening here? You know, I mean, and we've tried to say to them, the Equal Voices group at some parts of, we've said to them, well, you wouldn't do this with Aboriginal people. I mean, they used to. You wouldn't do this with Aboriginal people today. If you were talking about Aboriginal people, you would have them at the centre of it, and they would be shaping the thing.
Yeah, hopefully,
I'm looking at doing at the moment. We're exploring, seeing if we can get a book together which tells our own story and theology, but our own stories, because what won't be in this book and things, and hardly ever is the faith stories and experience of people is excluded, isn't it? Really, that's the thing. And and there's good reason, because if people hear those stories, then they hear God in people rather than sports, or they think about unity. So we're still framed to some degree in that. The Archbishop of Canterbury said about these sort of things. He said that in these issues there are no problems, there are only people. But the problem is that he doesn't live up to it himself sometimes. And certainly that's true, but we're still treating trans people as problems rather than people. And so until we shift, but part of the answer to that, as you said, is what we do as trans people, and we have to protect and nurture ourselves and everything. But I think if we're in a group and we've still got a commitment to it, and then some days you wonder about walking away, we need to be people, we need to be visible people, and we need to act rather than just being treated as problems. So that's the challenge. So, but it's exciting to me, I think, in a way.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I go around, people contact me from all sorts of places now, and read trans people popping up all over the place, in all kinds of unlikely things. And I did a thing in Newcastle recently for a Baptist church, and they had a whole weekend on Christianity and transgender people. Now, very few Anglican churches would dare to do that. This is a Baptist church, and a friend of mine who's sort of Pentecostal, and they came out as trans, and they told their story and their conversion stories, Christian story. And I just sort of think that that's the hopeful thing, that despite whatever the Catholic Church or other people will write officially, that underneath, this is the change is happening. But sometimes it's so painfully slow, isn't it?
Yes, very much. Yeah, so slow. And it reminds me of what you said about way back when you were sort of like in the 90s dealing with the issue of getting women to be ordained. And you mentioned like you could leave, but instead of getting ordained, like if you got ordained, then you could vote on the issue. So like when we, like, I don't blame people who do leave, but when we decide to stay, it means we can sort of force them to let us have a stake in the matter and actually say something about it.
That's right. And being creative as well. I think one of the things that we learned from the ordination of women was you can't just play the game. And if you go through the processes, and in the ordination of women, we got a lot of media publicity because the church mattered more to people. And the problem at the minute, I think, with churches is that the churches have receded in sort of esteem, probably even in America, so that actually, well, what happens in the churches is not a concern to a lot of people in the wider society, whereas it was back there with the ordination of women. So people were sort of put pressure on, if you see what I mean. The media were more interested, put pressure on the church to budge. And so some of the sort of middle ground sort of say, well, it's easier for us just to fix this. So we have to be creative and we can't just play the game. A friend of mine who's my sort of mentor, really, she trans priest, one of the first trans priests in England, and she's been absolutely gorgeous, and she's written books and things, a wonderful woman, Tina Beardsley. And she was part of a process in England, which looked a really good one by the Church of England, and they take time, and they involved theologians, they involved queer people and everything else. But she had to step away from it because she was the leading trans person. because she said it was structured. At the end of the day, there was still this power and control. So she's still working at it, but you have to step back and say, well, it's not. Sometimes you have to say a process is unjust, so we don't participate in it. That doesn't necessarily mean to say we leave altogether, but we create something else which is far more vibrant and life-giving, because otherwise they just suck the energy from you, I think. And churches do that very successfully. All sorts of more pathetic people.
Yeah, I think it's always so contextual, deciding sort of which step needs to be taken, whether there's a chance at changing things, and so you need to pour your energy into fixing it, or whether it is it's time to step away, that you don't want to be complicit in something that is unjust, especially when there's not as much hope of changing it.
That's right, and that is about, and that is a spiritual thing, isn't it?
Yes.
Like for queer community, I think. I mean, we're having a little issue at the moment here, bit of tension amongst people generally over how we respond to the current government's sort of proposals over religious discrimination and things, and it's going to be interesting. I think it's a conversation, and it's centered around, what place should religious people have some protections and things. Some queer people say, no, you've got religious freedom, you don't need to be worried about that. And if we sort of support anything for that, then that will support, and enable the right wing to get lots of what's in. But some of us are saying, no, hang on a minute, we actually want to be heard here. And that if you're going to have, freedom laws for and rights to people, it does need to include a recognition of religion as well, because actually some of us are more impressed in some ways than you are, because we're in this monster thing and we are restricted and things, and we want to have some rights to enable us to stand up against these right-wing religious people. So it's quite a complicated matter. But at the heart of it, I think, in that is, irrespective of the issue, is how people across the community, in this case the queer community, recognise that for some people that there needs to be some sort of dialogue, or it's the sort of the realism and the sort of revolutionary sort of thing, is that some people need to push out and be creative and pure and essentially oppositionist, but you also need some people within the system who are going to try and do things. And in relationship to the church, that's a similar sort of thing. It's like the church has never changed without, it's always changed from the margins, from the who rise up, whoever they are. Women, Francis, all those sorts of people in the past that have done stuff, transformative people. But it also needs people within it. That's my only hope for the Catholic Church. There are people like Pope Francis, who I know is a bit of a mixed bag, but people in the Vatican, you hope, so I pray and sort of try and support my Catholic friends, gay Catholics who are involved, and it's hard going, but it would make such a difference to the rest of us, wouldn't it, if the Catholic Church these things, because we this is why it's a solidarity of things that, and I think that's what I try and say to secularist queer people as well, is that you need us. You might think we're completely batty, and maybe we are. You actually need us, because whilst the church is transphobic and everything, you suffer and you'll continue to suffer. If we could help to change things, even if you think we're wrong and everything, and we'll take up some of the energy of these people, that don't need to deal with it, and then you can go on and create some fresh space and things. But we shouldn't have to do that, should we? Balance in the community and things over people. Well, you've sold out, or you're not properly free, or you guys are just bigoted about religion or something. Things, So it is a bit because I do find myself in a difficult position on that. I get attacks from some queer people, and I think that's quite a difficult position sometimes for people to handle. When you're getting so much rubbish from one side.
It is.
The friends, your community isn't always supportive. Do you know what I mean? That's what I'm saying.
It's that idea of breaking binaries again, where people say you cannot be both queer and Christian, or queer and religious, and so being in that in between space where you're both is really difficult. just thank you so much for all of your thoughts. Like, I feel so enriched just getting to hear everything. And I'm definitely, as I go back and edit this episode, I'm going to just be pausing it to think about it.
Listening to the podcast and so, I mean, I like the residents. I just go, oh yes, that's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's this. I mean, what I say is, I mean, I got off on tangents, but it's a product of different conversation. That's what we are. Is really because we've got this ridiculous idea that every person, this sort of Protestant sort of strong individualist thing, but we're all a product of a conversation. And that's the exciting thing. One of the exciting things to think about queer community, and what you're enabling is brilliant. That's the conversation from so many different strands and places, which enrich us. Sometimes they challenge us, sometimes they puzzle us. But if we can treat that in that way, then we'll get a little bit further with humanity and hope.
Yeah. You probably know, I usually end with just, if there's one last thing you would like to say, little bit of wisdom to share with trans people, what would it be?
I think I'd go back to the bit where at the baptism of Jesus, where the voice says, "You are my beloved, in you I am well pleased." And I don't think that's about Jesus. I think Jesus is representative of humanity in that, and I think that's what we have to hear. I think everyone has to hear that, but trans people particularly. So we need to know ourselves as beloved, as holy, and then all sorts of things can happen. And it's interesting in the Gospels because the temptations come sort of after that. And they're real, aren't they? The sufferings and struggles of our life. But if you are beloved, and that's the way I see Jesus was able to triumph over temptations because they knew that they were beloved and holy, which didn't mean so they didn't struggle on everything. And so if we know that, so even in the midst of struggle, that we're holy, and that's why I think we need to take time to know that, to pray or be with people or be in spaces or find the places that will enable us to know that we're loved and beloved.
Thank you all for listening to another episode of Blessed Are the Binary Breakers. It really means so much to me to get to share these stories with you all and to know that people are listening to them. But there's still a pretty small following for this podcast. If you get something out of it and it's safe for you to spread the word that it exists, please do so. On top of doing that, please rate and review this podcast on iTunes or wherever else you get it, because that is also a wonderful way to spread this podcast further. Along with sharing your time in that manner, you can also share some of your finances with me. If you're interested in becoming a patron of this podcast and the other work I do on the internet, please go to Queerly Christian on Patreon to set up a monthly donation. The people who are currently donating at the $12 per month level or higher are Willow Hoving, Rosina Page, Ron Hartzler, and Jay Gebner, who just joined my Patreon. Thank you so much, Jay, and to every other patron. The last thing I want to mention before wrapping up this episode is just a reminder that I currently have a call out for more interviewees. Specifically, if you are a trans woman, trans feminine, or otherwise assigned male at birth, and or you are a person of color, I really want to amplify your voices, because too often yours are the voices that are most silenced. So if you are interested in sharing your story on this podcast, please email me at queerlychristian36@gmail.com. And anyone else who just wants to chat or has any questions or feedback, ideas for how I can improve this podcast, you're also welcome to email me there. It would mean a lot to me if folks would just email to tell me what they like about it, if there's something they don't like about it, or just to say hi and tell me who you are. That'd be really cool, because so far I haven't really had many listeners interact with me, and I just think that would be fun. So drop by my Gmail or at queerlychristian.tumblr.com anytime just to say hi if you want. That's all I've got for you all. Remember that the next episode will be out not next Tuesday, but the one after that. And that's how it'll be from now on. Every other Tuesday, you can expect another episode. In the meantime, go break some binaries and be a blessing to the world with your life.